All right, we are live. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the GeoAsh podcast. This morning, me and Ash decided we're going to be interested in talking about the recent heated argument that took place in the Oval Office between Vladimir Zelensky and President Trump slash JD Vance. And I think a good point of departure would be in sort of understanding what exactly prompted the main disagreement or what exactly spurred the argument. And so I'll pose that question to you, Asher. From your point of view, in your opinion, what do you think um, was the prime contention between the two parties?
Yeah, so to sort of back up and set the scene for their conversation, it's my understanding, and I've heard this from a few sources, and everyone obviously do your own research, but it's my understanding that Marco Rubio prompted the meeting between Zelensky and Trump and Vance with uh, peace talks. So essentially, it was understood from the administration, Trump's administration's point of view that Zelensky was coming to the White House, the Oval Office, in order to propose a plan for peace. Because I think that's been clear, to the American people and to world leaders abroad that Trump is not a fan of this war that's sort of been taking place from his point of view, and I think you and I hold the same opinion unnecessarily. And so, yeah, Zelensky came in, and what was supposed to occur was, they were going to get towards the end of their conversation. And I think what's funny about the whole interaction in the first place, and it's funny that we're talking about it now, and I think it's been probably covered to great lengths by many sources, but
Sure.
I think it's a good thing that we're still going to be able to cover it and maybe hit some of the points that haven't been um, brought to the open or maybe brought to our viewers. But the conversation was focused heavily, or at least the broadcasted conversation was focused around what was the last like 10 to 15 minutes of what was truly like an hour and a half of conversation. So
Mm.
up until the point that most of us saw, which was where things started to get heated, um, things had been good. Things had been, they were kind of catching up. Things. What I'll point this out too. Trump, and you can find the footage early on, made a comment about Zelensky's dress, in that he wasn't dressed in all green fatigues, but he was in like black, more like a slightly more formal militaristic attire. And so, Trump was trying to keep it light. I think that's his deal anyways. He knows it's a serious situation, but he's also like, we're gonna, at least from his understanding, Marco Rubio had prefaced Zelensky with, "Hey, we're going in, and it's going to be peace talks at the end of the day." So,
Mm.
anyways, it becomes evident to Trump and to Vance towards the end of their conversation, those last 10, 15 minutes, that Zelensky essentially has no plan for peace. He has come to uh, maybe not forwardly request that, the U.S. would support Ukraine through like ground troops, but that it would at least support the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine in terms of support for Ukraine's side through weapon sales, and hopefully more funding. And so once that became apparent to Trump and to Vance, well, first of all, Vance was like, "Well, you're not. Clearly, you haven't heard us. Clearly, you haven't taken our position on this um, unending war seriously, because you haven't come with, um, a solution for peace." And so that's when things started to get heated, and
Mm.
it was crazy, man. Once Zelensky, and I'll let you make a comment on this too, or if you have a comment about this too, I'd be interested to hear it. But once Zelensky um, is confronted with opposition for probably the first time in a long time, from what are in his mind his allies. He's just he's back to like acting like a child. He doesn't know how to back his stance. He totally backs down from like he's not saying anything. This is the kicker for a lot of politicians for me. It's like he's not saying anything with any substance. He's
Mm,
just, kind of hitting those talking points that uh, are airy and have no substance. So
right.
yeah, I think they got to the end of that conversation, and people want to say he got kicked out of the White House. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think it was just like Trump and Vance were, and it's funny because Trump tweeted this or Truth Social this after the talks, as he was like, "We don't need to be so." It was something along the lines of, "We don't need to be so worried about the Putin and Zelensky thing. We need to be more focused on, what America has going on its borders and within its borders." And I think that's kind of their thing. They were elected for primarily those reasons, and a sort of a side quest for them would have been, let's try and bring peace to the region. So
Right.
yeah,
Right. 100%, man. The harsh reality of the situation is that, as Trump remarked during their heated argument, is Zelensky has no cards to play. He is not in a position to bargain. Like he has no real leverage in negotiations. And the thing is like all parties involved, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, the United States, or European countries, everybody wants the war to end, obviously, but they want it on their terms. And the thing which I found really difficult to grasp from, because I wanted to understand Zelensky's point of view, is like what exactly are the terms that he wants the war to end on? Because he's obviously not in favor of a ceasefire. It's like, and the question you have to ask is if you're not in favor of a ceasefire, then what exactly do you think is necessary to end the war? You know,
yep.
it's almost like his preferred strategy is to prolong the war such that it just results in the total collapse of the Putin Russian regime. I think that's actually what he wants. But that's a rather extreme conclusion. That's an extreme conclusion to the war. And obviously that's not realistic because from Putin's standpoint, this is an existential problem. Like he cannot afford to end the war on Ukraine's terms. Like it has to be on Russia's terms, or at worst, on some sort of compromise between an intermediary like the United States or, NATO and Russia, but
Yeah,
certainly not on Zelensky's terms.
right. And I think that's what the United States has, or at least Trump's administration has been pushing for this entire time. Is like we are not in any form going to be your backer any longer. We're prepared to be your intermediary. We're prepared to intercede, but we're not prepared to back you because we know that. And he made it super clear. He was like, "You're trying to start World War III. You're trying to start World
Yes.
War III because
Yes.
the alternative is, we along with NATO, the remainder of the NATO allies and Ukraine, take on a nuclear world power." And it's like since the '60s, the entire point of um, sort of this negotiation and what we'll get into more like the proxy wars is to avoid nuclear intervention, to avoid any sort of nuclear war.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I know that Zelensky at least is intelligent enough. Maybe he's not to know that, but hopefully he is to know that at the end of the day, he can't afford, his country can't afford, and the
No,
world can't afford
no one
a
can.
any sort of nuclear in a war. So um, I don't know if his idea is that he would just be able to secure more funding over the next, because clearly it was okay between 2020 and 2024 for him to just sort of fight this lose-lose war between himself or his country and Russia. Um, and maybe he was hoping to be able to extend that over the term of the Trump presidency. And I think a lot of that probably just has to go back to his own personal greed and the greed of his regime. which, I don't have any definitive proof for, but it's like once you know you're in a lose-lose situation, it seems like you're only trying to extend the livelihood of your power, right? You're trying
Mm-hmm.
to hold on to that power and to that supposed influence for as long as possible. And I don't, it blows my mind. People obviously offer different than you and I. So, um,
Apparently.
yeah, apparently,
Man,
but
just to pivot a bit here, one of the other things that I want to mention is from the Trump administration's standpoint. One of the things that I think most of us admire about what Trump is trying to do, like his objective, is to put more responsibility onto, um, not only nations like Ukraine that we support, but also our supposed allies in these situations, these situational conflicts where, the United States is expected to just carry the heavy load, carry the burden, the weight of all of this, this stuff. And Trump is effectively saying, with the negotiation between him and Zelensky, is look, if we're going to support you, like these are going to be the terms, and on top of that, we're going to get something in exchange for it, you know. But
yep,
in the same vein, like in a macro historical sense, one of the questions which I've encountered in trying to understand this problem is like globally, are we really de-escalating anything, or are we only creating a situation where like 10, 20, 30 years down the road, there's going to be yet another conflict, yet another reason for some country to become an aggressor in one situation or another? And the sort of evidence that I'll cite in towards that is the fact that, like, for example, the United States or Trump administration wants European countries to spend more on, their military budget. They want them to contribute more to their military budget. And the thing is like if we're globally, if everyone's having this incentive to just mount more weapons and more um, military dominance, if this is the incentive that people are heading towards, this sort of offensive strategy, then eventually it's a powder keg essentially. Like it's only a matter of time before World War III does break out, and so I think what this boils down to is like the United States is over here on the one hand, it wants to cement itself globally as the world superpower, be globally dominant, have global hegemony. And then you have Russia, which wants its sphere of influence in addition to, say, China. Um, and the thing is, like, at some point, like this, all of it boils down to existential problems. It's about survival. Like you said, from Zelensky's point of view, it's like if you're in a lose-lose situation, what you really, more than anything, what you desire is to preserve yourself, to preserve your power and your position. And I think that that's the position of so many of these countries. Not, I mean, really, that's the position of every major world power today. Because the stakes only keep getting higher and higher and higher and higher to the point to where it's like, and this has been going on for decades, like state-backed coups and these proxy wars where we sort of try to indirectly, you um, get our agenda across as a nation, and it sort of contradicts some of the values that we say we're fighting for, like democracy, for example. You know, and so
yep, yeah, and I think it's a it's a failing. Um, it's failed time and time again. There have probably been a very limited number of successes in uh, a state where we've backed a coup or we've um, sort of fought this proxy war and it serves, it hasn't served its purpose or the purpose from, the politician's mouth or whoever decided that we were going to take on this challenge. Yeah, another thing I want to point to, and you sort of brought this up, is Zelensky doesn't, or Ukraine is in a position where it's the front, right? It's the front of the current war. And what's so dangerous about, all these other countries sort of backing this front is because, and this is what blows my mind. is like how has um, the fact that we've backed the Ukraine side of the war to such an extent, how has it served to, tell Russians and Putin and his regime, um, or at least show them how much maybe we don't side with them in any respect? Because it's like, because if I had a friend, or maybe not a friend, if I had a an acquaintance who was at odds with me, and they were the only reason that they were like they held up in a conflict with me was because they had another group of friends that were sort of just feeding into them and giving them advice and sort of giving them weaponry against me. It would make me mad at more than just the friend who I initially had odds was at odds with. And I think that's the whole point is like we're number one, Trump is trying to become more of an isolationist. He has more of an isolationist stance in regard to America, although it's not in any way, a purist in the form of isolationism, but it is closer to what we have historically held to. Um, so, sort of backing off of that, I think that's I think that's a good thing. I think he's starting to reach a point of, hey, I've got priorities for the American people. This is why I was voted in, and we're over these overseas conflicts and trying to expand American influence. Our American influence in America is lacking. So, you
Yeah.
know, um, yeah.
Man, coming at this from the standpoint of a pragmatist, you could say that, okay, there were probably points in the history of the world when it was perhaps beneficial for the United States to be so hands-on in terms of geopolitics. It seems that nowadays it's not so beneficial for the United States to be hands-on in geopolitics because, I mean, given the track record, there's not really much to show for it except for greater and greater chaos and disruption and instability, and hostility. And so the thing which I agree that it's best that we should, move forward with an isolationist policy. Obviously, a lot of people don't see eye to eye with that, but at the end of the
And
day, it's
maybe isolationist is the wrong word. Maybe it's more of just a nationalistic policy. And
yeah,
if the majority, as was seen, with the election, is favorable of us focusing on things that are domestic as opposed to internationally, um, then that should be the responsibility of the administration. So
yes.
just to clarify.
Right. I think that's a good clarification, by the way, because it's not, obviously, like we don't think that the United States should like cut itself off from everybody, like in terms of trade and
Right. Yep.
commerce. Like, obviously, that's not the point of being isolationist. It's just being more introspective, being more domestic centric. Because at the end of the day, like everyday working Americans are struggling. Like they're not living the best quality of life. In many ways, they're not living a great quality of life because there's just such a huge burden, especially a financial burden. Like at the end of the day, so much of the so-called dominance of the United States, like globally, has been fueled financially by the taxpayer. You have
Yep.
a you have a very wealthy working class who's not investing in themselves. They're investing in all these chaotic, disruptive events overseas, you know,
Yep.
and we're not getting a good return on that investment is what it boils down to. And the thing is, if that continues, it will result in a collapse, a civilizational collapse, like without exception. This is one of the parallels that we can draw between the United States and Rome. Rome stretched itself thin because it was battling barbarians on its fronts, for several decades. And like eventually there comes a point to where you can't keep up, fighting on several fronts. Something has to
It,
give.
right. And then in the case of Rome, there was also dissension from within.
Yes.
And not that dissent is not that you shouldn't have dissensionists, but it was that there was a lot of quarreling on the home front, and I think that's what ultimately that's where the cracks started to form, and then it just grew out from there, and Rome was no more. Yeah, and and obviously that's the case with America today. It's if we can pull back from these various, all this funding that we have going to all of these causes that some are for America, some are completely, opposite to what America is and wants, then that'll be a positive. I just think about, and I know we spoke about this in our last podcast, but all of the corruption and the meaningless and useless spending that's taking place per the federal government um, around the world, and it's like, how did any of that become our responsibility, and how did all of those dollars start getting away from us? Like, how is that? How are some of those? And I mean, you could even take the funding of military equipment abroad. How did those interests become the interests of the American people to begin with? Why is that how my dollar is being spent?
Mm.
Um, and it's it's mind blowing. Um, you start to look at how we've been treated, and I've been getting a lot more into this lately, just because tariffs and trade have been on the headlines lately. Well, in extreme large part, the United States, in terms of trade, in terms of tariffs, has been on the losing side of the equation for decades, decades and decades. And the only reason that that's the case is because we are the richest and most powerful country in the world, and we can handle it. So, for example, pretty much the only reason that Canada can exist is because it has uh, abhorrent amounts of tariffs on goods that come in from the United States to Canada, and that's why they're able to spend so little on things like um that's why they're able to focus their dollars on things like healthcare and all these quote unquote free um services to its people, that's socialists abroad say that the United States should have as well, is because they don't have, they ride off the backs of the tariffs from the United States, but they also don't have to defend themselves because the United States is largely their defender. If you look at like the percentage of our GDP that goes to, or federal funding that goes to our military spending, as opposed to many nations around the world, but number one, Canada. It's like if Canada had to defend itself, defend its borders the way that we do, then none of those social programs for them would exist.
Mm.
They would largely be in the red. But all that's to say is we have been doing exactly that. We've been fighting the proxy war. We've been getting beat up for too long, and it's hopefully it's over. Well, we'll see.
Yeah, hopefully it is over, man. And you know what you just said, you hit on something really good. There are two sides to that coin, I think. So on the one hand, there is, the United States. Well, essentially, any country that has any form of military alliance with the United States is in a really great position because they don't have to incur the expense of creating a very strong military. They can just outsource that to the US. They just outsource that to the US. In the same vein, I think what a lot of politicians and even people today, what they have argued in order to support that, the reason they say it's a good thing, they won't word it this way, but in a sense, it is a way to keep, well, to maintain leverage. So, like, the reason the United States has a lot of leverage is because it is powerful. Not only like the prospect of being able to threaten its enemies, but the prospect to being able to either like give or withdraw support from its allies. And that's what gives it so much leverage from a military standpoint. So it's like two sides of that coin. But an analogy I was thinking of is I'm sure you experienced this when you were in college or high school, working on a group project. Like what's the typical norm? whenever you do a group project with anybody, right? Like eventually there's going to be like a minority of people in the group, maybe even one person in the group that is doing all the work because it's almost as if it's inefficient or it's ineffective to try to divide the work between all the other group members because at the end of the day, the other group members don't really have that great of an interest in participating. And so that's that's kind of the way I see the relationship between the United States and its so-called allies. It's like the United States is the guy in the group who gets screwed because he's doing all the work, you know?
Right. And the United States very much has the ability to do the work. Um, but I think there definitely is a relationship to be struck. It's like, okay, well, we can the United States could be okay with, being the sole provider of defense and maybe not the sole provider, but the largest provider of defense. And we can have those relationships where, hey, if you're attacked, we've got your back. But what we have allowed to occur for too long is that relationship has become extremely unfair in that the and first of all, to way back up, it's not even the United States, it's the American taxpayer that's footing the bill. And I think
Mm.
when we come back to that point, it makes it all the more evident that geopolitics is sort of this is the tip of the spear for what is the interests of the American people. And whenever the staff of that spear becomes pointed in a different direction, and even inwardly, and is like, no, we have our own defense to start caring about domestically, then we need to be able to flip that script. And I think what world leaders abroad are hopefully starting to see is, man, whenever we don't have the full interest of the United States taxpayer, we uh, we start lacking in a lot of areas, and we've kind of let it go too far.
Yeah.
Um, and I hope that's the trickle effect over the next 4 years is that because the United States is focusing more inwardly, all of these other countries that we have good relationships start focusing more inwardly and start to realize that, hey, we've got to flip the script on what we are comfortable with outsourcing and what we aren't comfortable with outsourcing to the United States. Um, but we'll see. It's a tale of time and not of just what the reaction has been over the last couple months. So I think that's interesting too. So what we saw almost immediately after the Ukraine or the Zelensky and Trump meeting was the partial backing of the EU, and even some things were even said. And I'm curious to know if you got to this in your research. Um, was that so Britain sort of took the head on, hey, we're going to support you by giving you $2 billion of funding for, you know, military use for arms funding, that sort of thing on the front line. After Trump was like, nope, we're done, we're out. Since you have no solution for peace, we're done with you. Um, and well, and I'm sure a lot of people know this, but that was a drop in the bucket. $2 billion is a drop in the bucket compared to what
Yeah,
the United States was
yeah.
ultimately shilling out. Um, and then the same was the case for like a few of the other EU countries, but I believe it was Italy and like Romania who pretty much were like, nah, we're not going to participate in number one, the funding of the Ukraine and Russia conflict. We're also not going to participate in uh, putting any of our troops. And so that creates an interesting rift in NATO, which
Hmm.
we will see how it plays out over the next. I mean, it's been playing out for the last week or so, but I'm sure the next month we'll see some big changes.
Yes. Man, I came across an article that said something along the lines because, okay, I think at this point, most people sort of agree that without the United States, NATO has really no firing power, like at the end of the day. And there are some people trying to make the argument in this article that if the United States were to totally withdraw its support, from Ukraine and just say like, nope, like we're done, like period. Somebody in Europe's going to have to, or Europe in total is going to have to, band together and fill this vacuum. Um, this person was making the argument that Europe could do that, and I call BS. I was like, if they can do that, then why is the United? I mean, like we're in a totally separate continent. It's like if they can do it themselves, why are they not doing it? I call BS. Like that
Yeah.
is that is a baloney, man. I don't take that I don't take that claim seriously at all. Um, I have a really blunt question, which is, and this is sort of getting into the Russian POV, the Russian point of view. Um, how do you think Russia honestly expects this war to end? Like it's going to end, that's for sure. But how do you think Russia is expecting it to end realistically?
I think Putin is waiting on America's play. I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested to, and this is far-fetched, figuring this out, but I'd be interested to know what he was thinking prior to, the results of the election. Because I think if Kamala had won in place of Trump, we would have likely sustained that the Ukraine Russia conflict for a number of years, right? And that also begs the question, would Russia have been able to afford, kind of like you were saying at the very beginning, would Russia have even been able to afford a conflict going on that long? So presently, I think he understands that he understands Trump's new worldview or a new view on the nation in that Americans, the American taxpayer, wants to back out of these proxy wars, the war in Ukraine being probably top of the list,
Hmm.
Israel and Hamas probably being second. But because of that, um, either one of two things will happen. NATO will have to ultimately, start putting troops on ground, and Russia will therefore be in a war with NATO nations, and we'll probably see a couple withdrawals of nations because of that. I think Italy and Romania, like I said, but also the United States. I mean, Trump's already made it clear that he has no interest in putting troops on the ground, obviously not getting us in another war. So then it's sort of Europe, or at least parts of Europe, in a war with Russia, which will be interesting. Obviously, not a good thing. That very much sounds like the start of World War III to me. And then I think the alternative is that sort of this peters out. This. I mean, we've already seen, like I said, a fraction of the funding that the United States gave over the last decade or so from Britain. Granted, $2 billion, so it's not a small amount, but just given that they probably can't afford it, the EU probably can't afford it to the same degree that the United States could. That the war will inevitably peter out, and some sort of negotiation will take place. So I think that's the long-winded version of saying that either some form of negotiation is going to take place. Now, whether that's favorable to Russia or to Ukraine, we'll see. I think things are probably pointing towards the Donbass region, I believe, is the region that's very favorable towards Russia being annexed. So that ultimately becoming a part of Russia, or somehow Ukraine retains that landmass and those people. Um, and I think, I mean, this is all just conjecture and sort of theorizing as to what could happen, but we'll likely see some sort of regime change within Ukraine. I think his people are probably over his totalitarian um, rule, you know, and we can get into this too. And I'm sure you've done your research, but just the way that he's been conscripting soldiers into to the front lines is totally totalitarian, totally totalitarian.
Hmm.
Um,
So how exactly has Zelensky been conscripting his troops?
Recently, I've seen a few videos of people rolling up on men. So I think right now, I don't know what the current policy for conscription is in Ukraine, but um, they historically have had, I mean, since the beginning of the war, they've had anywhere from not children, but like 17, 18-year-olds up to old men fighting on the front line. And that's because they've, I mean, it's a war that essentially requires all bodies.
Yeah.
Um, and so their conscription process as of late, this has been prevalent online, has been that people that work for the regime, just military personnel, I guess, will roll up on men of military age, grab them up, sometimes beat them up in the process, throw them into the back of a van, and take them to the front line.
Holy heck.
And it's been occurring all over Ukraine. There's several videos about it. You can go look it up. You can find these videos. Um, but and that's because I think many Ukrainians, and this won't be the what's talked about in the news or the mainstream narrative, but many Ukrainians are not in favor of this war, and they know that their men are just going out there and dying. And I think uh, the total death toll is probably a lot higher than is said.
Hmm.
And I mean, to Trump's point, to so many on the conservative right's point in America, it's just a lose-lose situation for everyone. You're losing generations of young men, and that is being replaced by these weak men who are totalitarian, and it's just not a good look for Ukraine, um, especially if they want to maintain any sort of sovereignty. It's just it's not good.
Yeah. Man, so you brought up a really good point, which I don't know like the statistics on this, but I'd be curious to know like what percentage of Ukrainians would, or to be more specific, you mentioned the Donbass region. Like what percentage of Ukrainians in the Donbass region would be interested in saying like, hey, this is a lost cause, let's just go ahead and become a part of Russia. Like I
Well, I
wonder.
think from the beginning, go ahead.
No, that was it. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say from the beginning, I think the Donbass region has been in favor of Russia. They were Russia, I think prior to World War II or something like that. And then after World War II, after the whole East Germany, West Germany ordeal, and sort of the surrounding nations felt the same thing with the USSR, and they might have even been part of the USSR up until a point, but there was eventually secession and borders were redrawn, and the Donbass region was part of the USSR historically, or Russia, and then it became a new nation state with Ukraine. And I don't know all the history there, but they they're not the same people. They're not the same tribe historically.
Mm.
There's different dialects, different cultures, and so like I said, the Donbass region has largely been in favor of being Russian. Um, and I think they even so that's another thing, and you know, correct me in the comments below if I'm wrong, but um, it was either the 2014 election or one of the elections after that, where the Donbass region essentially said, and it might have been in the case with Zelensky coming into power, they were like, "We're ready to be part of Russia." It was a majority vote to become Russian, and Zelensky took authoritative power around that time and essentially nixed that in the bud and said, "No, y'all are gonna remain a part of Ukraine." And again, I don't think that's the part a part of the prevailing narrative, unfortunately, and um, which allows Ukraine in large part to maintain its, oh, we're the ones who have always been fighting the Russians and sort of always had the short end of the stick
Hmm.
uh, when when it's Ukraine has been just as authoritarian, or Zelensky and his regime have been just as authoritarian as Putin and his regime have been in terms of, you know, what we uh what we take for granted as rights every day. So like free speech, speaking out against the government in Ukraine is just as dangerous as doing so in Russia. And yet the West is like, no, Ukraine is this beacon of democracy and freedom in Eastern Europe. And it's like, you guys have your head so far up your butts. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's kind of like people are selectively presenting certain details about the conflict.
Right,
I mean, just the mere fact that you pointed out that even within Ukraine, there's these two distinct, or probably even more than two distinct peoples, in embracing different cultures and different values and ideas and even political objectives. And the fact that um, that's one of the things that isn't hit on. Like usually the way it's presented is that the Ukrainian people are unanimous in their support of Zelensky and his leadership, and the objectives sort of that he's sort of pushed since he's been in office. And that's just not true. And that's rather evident to anybody who has obviously it's not only studied the history of this conflict, but any conflict. It's far more complex than just saying like, oh, you got the good guys here, the bad guys here. It's like when you start using the word we, you got to be careful about how you define we. It's like the Ukrainian people have just as much diversity amongst themselves in terms of opinions and beliefs and political ideals as any other people. And so, yeah,
right.
that's a very worthy point to mention.
So I've got an article from 2019, November 9th, 2019 from the Kiev Post. And again, I don't know the legitimacy of this and where they necessarily got their facts from, but it says half, 50.9% want, and this is within the Donbass region, want a union with Russia, and another 13.4% said that the region should accede to Russia with a special status.
Wow.
Um, So, I mean, essentially the whole article talks about that for the whole of Donbass, including the its Ukraine-controlled areas, 49.6% want it to become part of Russia, with another 13.3 choosing such a scenario with a special status for Donbass.
Hmm.
Um, and again, I don't know, the legitimacy of those polls, but just from what I can tell, it's a region that doesn't want to stick around and is sort of tired of it didn't like the fact that it had to, or the people there didn't like the fact that they had to become a part of Ukraine when they had historically been Russian. And I think that's why you probably see so much dissent from that area of the world or that region within or between Ukraine and Russia.
Hmm.
So,
Yes. Well, man, at the end of the day, it's like as Americans, some of the ideals that we were founded on, we embrace the idea that people should have the right to self-determine. They should have the right to be autonomous and self-sovereign. And at some point in the midst of all this conundrum, we have to ask ourselves, not just Americans, but everybody like has to ask themselves is like, man, what exactly are we fighting for? Are we fighting for those ideals? Or are we only using that as a front? And I think that it is the latter. We're using it as a front. Like when I see the amount of military installations that the United States has around the world, and I understand the argument in favor of that, it does present this stark contradiction, you know, between saying that other countries should be independent and they should be free. If they should be independent and be free, then why are we having an iron grasp on so many countries around the world? and trying to be like this empire, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I recently listened to a podcast between Tucker Carlson and the Prime Minister of Qatar. So Qatar is one of the richest Middle Eastern nations. I think it's on the Gulf of Arabia, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm.
I think my geography there is correct. But when he was talking with him, and I agreed with a lot of what he had to say. The Prime Minister and everyone should go listen to this podcast because it's a really interesting. Kind of back to my point about like politicians, how they have a certain way of talking where it's like not you're not gonna get fired up over him necessarily. It's very just like we're keeping the status quo sort of
Very,
speech.
very
He
diplomatic.
was very much like that, and it's funny because I say that, and I think like Donald Trump is sort of the opposite of that.
Oh yeah.
He's he is okay with being divisive, whereas this guy was not just out there in any sort of way. Very within the status quo of like let's keep things cool. But anyways, um, one of the points he made was that he and the Middle Eastern region, Qatar is, and this is, we're totally getting off of what Ukraine has going on, but Qatar has some very interesting ties with like Islamic nations, and in large part, the United States has been at odds with these like uh, I forget the difference between Sunni and Shia nations, but we've been at odds ever since, the 90s, maybe even the 80s, up until to now. Up until now, obviously, we had the Iraqi and Afghanistan wars
Mm.
and like the Gulf War back in the 90s. Um, so, anyways, his point was we are ready for the United States to sort of back off as this police, as the police of the world, and as the police of this region. He thinks uh, I'm pretty sure what he had to say was it's hurt the region more than anything. It hasn't allowed it to find its own means of diplomacy. And I actually completely agree with that line of thinking in that the United States has so much of a responsibility to the world's peace. So like if we can send I'm very much in favor of like using our special forces or using our um forces that aren't going to have to put like physical troops on the ground for prolonged periods of time, especially in foreign countries that, again, we have no interest in. But if we can help in some way where it's like, all right, we've got, this hostage situation here, or we've got this, um, there's clearly a terror cell here. I'm fine with utilizing our services in that way. But his point was we as a region of the world have started to formulate our own means of diplomacy and negotiation, and the United States needs to trust in that. And I think I really agree with that line of thinking. We have for too long, and I get that it's that part of that is we're set on maintaining our power as a world leader. It's like if we can have that leverage where, hey, we can come in and overthrow your people and overthrow your military and install a dictator, like we have that power. Well, that's a lot of leverage over, specific world leaders, but it all comes back to what are the interests of the taxpayer. Um, and I think that the Prime Minister of Qatar sees that the American people are kind of over this, the United States is the world's policeman narrative or line of thinking, and that we need to start backing away from that, letting each region sort of do its thing.
Mm. Man, I look forward to giving that podcast a listen. Always like listening to Tucker's podcast.
Hmm.
Um, One of the questions which sort of just fell into my mind while you were saying that is, if the United States does back off from being the police of the world, that does create a power vacuum. And so the question then becomes is like, who takes that place because it's not going to be the case that nobody seizes the position of being world police if that position's available. Like there's going to be somebody who wants to do it, you know. Now, whether that's going to become destructive for that respective entity, party, country, whoever, that's another ordeal. But the fact is that there's always going to be someone who vie for complete dominance, being the number one status, being in the number one status. And quite obviously, if I can use a term that's been thrown around in hip hop lately, there is a big three. You know, there's the United States, China, and Russia. You know, so
Yeah.
which China is obviously like quite a ways ahead of Russia in terms of its economic and military dominance. But um, and that brings up another interesting segue, which is like on the horizon. You know, we've been talking about Ukraine, Europe, the United States, Russia. But on the horizon, we have another conflict brewing in Asia between China and their hopes to annex Taiwan within probably this decade, you know, and like what is that going to spell for for geopolitics, for global politics? Um, this is why, like earlier, I was speculating and asking myself, like in a grand historical sense, is World War III inevitable? And the harsh truth is that I think that if we continue in this direction, not just the United States, because it's that at the end of the day, it's much bigger. There's more players than the United States, you know. Um, the answer is that yes, it's like there is going to be another worldwide conflict. And one could argue that we're already embroiled in some form of a world war. You know, it's just confined to Europe mo mainly, you know. So yeah, man, I do think, you know, it is a great thing that the United States is trying to like back off and folk be more like introspective, be more, you know, inward focused. But in the same vein, it does create a power vacuum. And that's always been the rationale, I think, from the standpoint of anybody who argues in favor of the United States intervention in international politics in any form is, well, if we don't do it, who will, you know? And if it's like if you have a virtuous leader, right? If you have a virtuous leader and they're acting in a way that is virtuous, that works out great. But once that leader becomes corrupt, that's when it becomes a huge problem.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to point to is um ideally, nobody would play dirty. Nobody would play um you know, be okay with just immoral means of uh playing geopolitics, but that is unfortunately not the case. And the one positive I sort of see on the horizon is that I don't think the United States has given its economic power enough enough weight over the course of the last, 20, 30 years. Like we are the world economic superpower. The reason that China is as rich as it is because we've allowed it to become as rich as it is, and it has largely taken economic advantage of us in many ways. And so, I look at something like the conflict between Taiwan and China, and I'm hopeful in that the only way that the annexation of Taiwan will occur is if the United States allows it to m militarily. So even if and even if we do back off militarily, economically, because the United States is, China's number one customer, and that is the case for pretty much all of the world in terms of like exports and imports. And so, if we take that privilege off of the table, and granted that would have its own effects here, but if we take that privilege off the table for China, who knows how long they can sustain something like, this imperialistic worldview moving forward. Um, and I think that also is the case for anyone who were to try to usurp that role of the world's policeman. And I don't think, it's almost like
is it even necessary? And this is all just, very theoretical. But um, I think, you know, the United States has for too long relied on its military power abroad, and that is fine. And hopefully, we start to focus that inwardly and we start to focus domestically. But we don't, like I was saying, give our economic power, our economic prowess enough weight, which I hope is the case for the next couple years. But we'll see.
Hmm. We will see indeed.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I, this is probably like the biggest pivot of all in this conversation because you and I are both Christians, and like oftentimes we don't just want to sift through these problems, these events and developments from a purely secular point of view. We also want to apply a spiritual point of view. And one of the things which I ask myself about like world history is like what is everything culminating in? Like what is inevitably going to like we know we've read the end of the book, like we know what this is building up to. And I think like anybody who has a non-Christian worldview per se, they think that it's culminating in utopia. Like if you look at the ideas which emerged throughout modernity, the Enlightenment, ideas which are still popular to this day, people seem to think that, oh, if we just make more inventions and we just innovate and we just um, stimulate our economy and just this and this and this and this, then we'll eventually get to a point to where if we just industrialize more, we'll get to a point to where we create a global utopia. And I think quite the opposite is true. It's like, no, if anything, I think that the past 500 years shows that as we gain more and more and more stuff and more ability, we only become more effective at becoming being self-destructive, you know. And anyway, I point that out because, if you look at uh, the book of Revelation, like for example, you see a world that is characterized by devastation, you know, and there's one way to interpret it. You could say that it's God's judgment coming down on the world, or you could say that in a sense it is self-caused, in a sense like we have chosen our fate. Perhaps it's a mix of both. I don't know. But anyway, I say all that to say, like, I don't know when, I don't know how, I don't know the specifics of the details, but I know that eventually I feel certain eventually that, we're not, contrary to the popular mainstream secular worldview, we're not going to get to some point globally where it's just happily ever after. I think if nothing else, like all of this is everything that we've discussed up until this point is merely evidence of how broken and depraved mankind can be. You know, it's like at our best, like this is us at our best, trying to cooperate, whether diplomatically or competitively or whatever. Like it's at the end of the day, it's resulting in greater and greater animosity and greater, higher and higher stakes, for people to sort of secure their interests. And so,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we just maintaining being okay is like if I were to enter politics in any form, it would just be I'm just trying to maintain
yes,
like us being fine,
yes, yes,
as
yes.
long as we can like we got means to work, we've like economic prosperity is decent, um people are have some form of livelihood, they still have their inalienable rights, then we're doing okay because exactly that. We're never, ever, ever going to reach a point because of human imperfection, because of the fallen nature of man, where we we're like good, we're good for eternity. And I think that that is what many, many world leaders, especially those that don't hold um, any sort of religious viewpoint, specifically Christian, a Christian viewpoint is what they hope for is that someday we'll be able to achieve world peace through diplomacy or peace through strength. And that's just simply not the case. And so, I'm I'd be interested to know what uh what the majority of politicians think. Do they think that we will eventually achieve some form of like true utopianism, or will we always are we always just striving for being okay? And history has kind of showed us that in large part we've just kind of been maintaining being okay. We haven't destroyed ourselves with nuclear weapons yet, so that's a positive. Um, we
Yeah.
did lose millions and hundreds of millions of soldiers or people during World War II, and wars prior to that. Millions of people have been, probably billions up to this point, have been lost through the various wars that have taken place since the beginning of mankind. And
Mm.
yet here we still are, and we're still trying to do our best, um, and get on to the next thing, solve problems as they come up. So yeah, I think that's a great point to point out is that uh, it is my belief, and I guess it is your belief, that we will never achieve perfection. We will never achieve utopia. And so all of this is just to try and achieve what is hopefully the best we can do in spite of or despite our fallen nature.
Mm. Right. But but ultimately, man, it's another point, and this honestly, this segues into like literally we could dedicate another podcast to this topic, in my opinion, and perhaps we should. Um, but I think about like, you have the spiritual and then you have the carnal. There's this dichotomy that's drawn in the New Testament, especially in Romans 8, specifically. The difference between walking in the spirit, walking in the flesh. And those who are in Christ, who mind the things of the spirit are walking in the spirit, whereas those who are not in Christ are walking in the flesh because they're minding the things of the flesh. And so one of the things that you said that stood out to me the most is like if you were to enter politics, you would focus on, maintenance, maintain. Like let's just kind of learn to be content with the things we have and make marginal improvements in a very realistic, sort of pragmatic way, rather than thinking that we're going to like create utopia in a few decades. The reason that most people don't think that way is because their worldview is shaped by this idea that mankind is, in a sense, God. Like mankind is the center of the universe. And so much of what we do, like culturally and especially technologically. And the reason I want to emphasize technology is because, like, going forward, more than ever in world history, I think what's going to shape world events more than anything is technological progress. Or I don't even like to use the word progress. I would just say technological development, you know, like the extent to which AI and machine technology and robotics is about to just like totally revolutionize economics and by extension society is something which it's going to be very disruptive, and it already is disruptive, But my point is in bringing that up is that a lot of people think that if we just apply all these tools, like with the carnal perspective, you think if we just do all these things, we'll be able to make more money, we'll be able to create more wealth, we'll be able to have, better livelihood or standard of living. They're focused on carnal things. That's the point I wanted to mention. It's like the metric of our success, the metric of our welfare and our well-being becomes these carnal metrics, but we neglect the quality and the state of our soul, the condition of our soul. It's like, and I think in many ways, like I'm not going to single out the United States. I don't think it's a problem that just affects the United States, and I don't think it's a new problem. I think it's a problem that has always existed. It's what Jesus articulated as, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? You could apply that to a nation. You could apply that to all nations. It's like at the end of the day, we have to remember that, like for example, wealth is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. Money is not an end in itself, it's just a means to an end. You know, the same goes for any other thing that, the carnal worldview regards as a good, like technology. You know, it's getting to the point to where like I've started to see people in various fields have these emerging ideas where they're talking about we're going to find out a way to integrate the human biology with the machines technology so that we can like live forever. And it's like, are you people insane? Like it's like stuff that used to be science fiction is like in reality on the horizon. And I think that what it boils down to is that like people are blinded, by the prince of this earth or the god of this world, as Paul would have said, Satan. They're blinded, and they have a very warped view of reality because it's not a spiritual view of reality. You know, and so and that is all that is to say is that like eventually there's going to come a day when the Antichrist presents himself, and
Yep.
don't know if that will be in our lifetime, but I do know that in the grand scheme of things, that is what all of this, geopolitics is culminating in. And hopefully that doesn't come soon. Hopefully we can stave that off for a while. But yeah, that's my spiel.
It's good. I think you're exactly right, and that's what we have to be extremely careful of. And I know I've been guilty of this, and I'm sure you've been guilty of this. But to assume that we are the ones that can make things right, or that we are the one, or that anybody is the one that can make things right for us. So, you can definitely apply this to either sides of the political spectrum and their leaders, um, is we have to be extremely careful not to idolize, one side over the other, and
Mm.
assuming that, hey, if Trump gets into office, he's going to be able to do this and this and this, and then things are made good, you know? And that's just not the case. And I think that's been a theme of this podcast is it doesn't happen at the max level. It happens with starting with you and the family and then the community.
Yes, yes.
Um,
Round up.
Round up, y'all. So
Bottom up.
bottom up. It's good.
Nice.
Well, you would call it there?
Yeah, I was about to say, unless you had any more thoughts,
That's all I got.
yeah, I was about to say, man, I really enjoyed that conversation, dude. Thank you for hopping on a pod today. And thank you guys for listening and watching as always. We appreciate your support. If you have any comments, critiques, etc., leave those down in the comment section below. We always love to hear from you guys. And yeah,
Share with your friends and family. We do want to start getting this out there more, and hopefully Gio and I will start to be able to put this podcast on a little bit more consistently than we have in the past. So,
yes, sir.
yep.
All right. Checking out. See you guys next time.
See y'all.